Everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Faculty of Science and Technology, University of the West Indies, Mona campus. This is the 17th forum in the FST's Science for Today forum series. For the next 2 hours, we are tackling gender-based violence in a forum entitled Leveraging Technology in the Fight Against Gender-Based Violence in Jamaica. I am Marvadeen Singh-Wilmot, lecturer in the Department of Chemistry here in the FST, and I'm also the FST representative on the Institute for Gender Development Studies, MONA unit. Now, gender-based violence and violence against women are often used interchangeably in Jamaica and worldwide, but we must be clear that GBV is violence against someone based on gender-related factors and can affect people of all genders. It is also true that worldwide, and certainly in Jamaica, violence against women and girls is what is being reported, and I say reported. And the reports are reflecting that 1 in 4 or 25% of Jamaican women have suffered from physical or sexual abuse in their lives. We hear it every time we turn on the news. In fact, the problem has exacerbated since COVID-19, and the accompanying lockdowns seem to have made the situation worse. So we have an urgent problem that is threatening to stifle our progress towards peace and prosperity, which are objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. But guess what, everybody? All is not lost, and science has the solutions. Studies have shown that technology-based solutions can help to address GBV. And we are not just talking about using technology to respond, we are talking about leveraging technology in both prevention and response. So this evening, we have an impressive lineup of speakers, 5 speakers, in fact, who will each have 15 minutes to talk to you on various topics. And during the presentations, you will be invited to send in your comments and questions using the chat option. At the end of the presentations, the speakers will respond to your comments and your questions. So you will indicate which speaker your comment or question is directed at. Speakers will try to keep to the time so that we can have a robust discussion at the end of the talks, and we can get to hear from you, the audience. So now I invite our first speaker, Dr. Carpenter, acting head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies here on the Mona campus. Dr. Karen Carpenter, everybody, is the acting head, I said, of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. She's a Florida board certified clinical sexologist and a licensed psychologist in Jamaica. Dr. Carpenter is also the director of the Caribbean Sexuality Research Group, and that is located at the University Hospital of the West Indies. She's the editor of Interweaving Tapestries of Sexuality and Culture, author of Questioning Jewish Caribbean Identity, Love and Sex, The Basics, and co-author of Language, Race, and the Global Jamaican. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, psycholinguistics, and issues of identity. Dr. Carpenter will speak this evening on a topic entitled Gender-Based Violence in Jamaica. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. As head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the Mona unit, part of our mandate certainly is advocacy in this area of protection of minorities, protection of vulnerable communities, and certainly women and children are the most vulnerable within this context. But as has been pointed out, when we say gender, we don't mean women, we don't mean female, we mean the sex role that you are assigned or choose to play within a society. And those are social constructs. So we're born male or female or intersex, and then we are socialized, acculturated into gender roles. And so when we speak about gender-based violence, we're really talking about violence, as Marvadeen has said, based on the role you are playing within a gendered context. Yes? So when you're playing the role of female, when you're playing the role of mother, daughter, child, these are the roles that we play. And society has some clear ideas about how we should behave in playing these roles. So what exactly is this gender-based violence? Why are we not speaking generally about violence? Because we are a society that suffers from a great deal of violence. The reason we're speaking about gender-based violence is that the violence is perpetrated because you do not have access to certain things within that gendered role. The causes, and some of the interchangeable terms that we use to talk about gender-based violence, is gendered violence, or violence that is intimate partner violence, which occurs between two or more partners. And also we have domestic violence, which can also be gendered. Within the home, we have violence that can be perpetrated because of the person's gender. When we look at a social role that we play in gender, one of the things that we consider is how do we emphasize differences between us? We've heard very often about men are from Mars, women are from Venus, when really the truth is we're more alike than we are different. But focusing on those minimal differences, as Freud would say, helps us to rationalize, to excuse ourselves for the violence that we perpetrate against another gender. And certainly among the gender-based violence concerns that we have is violence against the LGBT plus community. And at present, we have over 56 labels for what your gender could be. So focusing on minimal differences also helps us to look at someone else, man, woman, boy, child, LGBT plus community, as a different species. That looking at someone as a different species, what we call pseudo-speciation. And once we can say, because of the color of your skin, because of the color of your eyes, because of the size of your body, because of the gender role you play, you are different from me, and we can't possibly share the same humanity or needs, then it becomes a lot more easy for you to be violent towards a person, to discriminate against them, and to play on their vulnerabilities. So those two conditions are necessary for the violence to take place. The perpetrator must first see you as being very different from them, yes? and also to put you in a category that dehumanizes you, objectifies you. Michael Kimmel, who is one of the few academics that I'm going to introduce you to today, for those of us who want to read further on the topic, writes a wonderful book called The Gendered Society. And if you look at the cover of the book, you'll notice it's the 6th edition. Well, I'm sure by now there's a 7th, possibly an 8th. And one of the things that Kimmel raises is the question of differences. He says, if we come from different planets, Mars and Venus, and we have different brains and different brain chemistries and different hormones, and we speak and listen differently, and our morals are different, so what's okay for a man to do, what's okay for a woman to do is different, then how is it that we live together, we take the same classes in school, we eat the same food, we read the same books, we receive the same grades according to the same criteria in a society that tells us that we are so different? Surely, if we are so different, then we should not be held to the same standards. So we have to examine those social rules that we've inherited over the years that says it's okay for men and women to be treated differently. So on a social, psychosocial level, social constructs that help to perpetuate gender-based violence, we look at 4 different categories. We look at the society. What are the norms that we allow men and women in a society? Are men allowed to be more violent than women in a society? Is it an expectation of ours that men be violent in order to assert their masculinity? Is a man who is non-violent non-masculine? And that's certainly the case of Jamaica. When we accept violence as a way to resolve a conflict, instead of speaking about the conflict, seeking resolution, the first thing we do is go to blows. That also helps with gender-based violence. When we think that masculinity means aggression, dominance, defending your honor, and that men cannot be any way but this one way, this violent, aggressive way, then we're encouraging gender-based violence. Communities also encourage it, and certainly communities where there is high density, high poverty, low socioeconomic status, and unemployment, it does engender more violence. That doesn't mean that communities that are not like this, that communities that are better off are immune. They're not at all immune. And of course, when we associate with peers who say to us, yeah, you have big money, you have to defend yourself, then clearly that also helps to encourage violence. When we isolate women and children, when we keep them out of the public sphere, when we take away or they are not empowered to have rights within the public sphere, they tend to be victims at a higher rate than women who are in fact engaging in the public sphere. Relationships also cause lots of conflict, whether marital or relational conflict. And when men control the wealth because of their larger body mass and the propensity towards meeting our social standard for being a violent male in order to be masculine, we do have these things cropping up. The way to solve the problem is that you're going to hit the person, you're going to deprive them of certain things, you're going to psychologically beat them down. Okay, and when the wealth and decision making resides in the hands of any one member of the family, whether male or female, then we also have a power and control issue. Resentment in relationships often leads to explosions as well. So sometimes what we see as a trigger for the behavior seems like nothing. You say, but it can't have been that. It couldn't be over the loaf of bread because the resentment has been building for some time. And then for the individual perpetrator, often they have grown up in a home where they've witnessed mother or father either giving or receiving violent acts as a child. So children who are subject to homes where violence is perpetrated are often more likely to commit violent acts as adults themselves. Absent and rejecting fathers is another corollary of gender-based violence. And abuse as a child. I want to underscore that one challenge that may occur. I want to also point out that alcohol use is often present, but it is not the cause of the gender-based violence. What it does is it disinhibits us. It makes us feel that we have more freedoms. And here's a way of understanding those same four concepts again. We start with the individual at the center of that social hierarchy of violence, and then the relationships that they've been in, whether they're family relationships or current adult relationships. The community that says a man must beat a woman, or a woman must beat her man, for that matter. And a society, a larger society, that says that you're not a man, you're not powerful, you're not standing up for yourself unless you're violent towards another person. Yeah? And that's called the ecological framework. Yeah, big fancy word for saying all of these things are interrelated and they're embedded in each other. When we look at Jamaica and the Caribbean, we know that young women who are 20 to 24 years old, of those young women, if in the studies on the Women's Health Survey, which is one of the biggest studies about women's health that we currently have, it's a 2016 survey, we're due another one soon. Of the ones in the sample, 13 of the ones who were subject to gender-based violence were in fact unemployed. We do see that where women are unemployed, the threat of poverty increases the threat of violence and vulnerability. So that tells us that where women have access to funds, they are less likely to stay for the violent acts. That doesn't mean that every woman will leave. And it doesn't mean that every woman will dissolve her family. It's a very tricky issue. Yes? And there are women who have funds and are in a situation where they won't leave because they've become so accustomed to the violence. Almost half of the females in that age group, again, 15 to 24, and we're looking at 15 because 15 is the age of initiation in Jamaica. That's when most young people become sexually active in this country. And that age of initiation to the age of 24, when you'd imagine that they begin to think about families, at least half of the females who are in that age group and sexually active were forced into sex. So either they didn't want it, it was taken from them, or they reluctantly agreed because they were coerced into it. And when young women can't choose when they'd like to have sex, when this is a power decision over them, then they're not likely to use contraception. And this is very, very important because women's reproductive health is another key indicator for vulnerability, where a woman cannot protect herself against sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, pregnancy, and the timing of pregnancy. She becomes more and more dependent on the man for income. And that increases the likelihood that she will stay in a violent relationship because she's afraid of what it will do to the children if she leaves. How am I going to feed myself? How are they going to go to school? These are real concerns. So the unmet needs for contraception among adolescents in this country is a serious, serious problem that we have, and a serious problem that has to be dealt with, not with the young people, but with the older people who are preventing young people from getting access to a condom, access to some kind of preventative measure that can keep them safe from an STI or from an early pregnancy. And we seem to have a sort of wholesale social view in the society that, you know, if you are getting sexually active at 15, then you deserve to get an STI, you deserve to get HIV, you deserve to get pregnant. That's a very backward view. And we have to look at ourselves very carefully. Yeah? Some of the things that can help us and has helped in the fight against domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and gender-based violence is the advocacy of people who are public figures, people in the public eye, such as this interview, and you can look it up. I won't take up time by playing it here. And it was on November 25th, 2019. And there are many others since then. And it was on Smile Jamaica. And this was our ambassador, Aluna Sambo. And she tells her own story of the shame and the disgrace that accompanies being someone who should be in a better position, but finds yourself in an abusive relationship, and how hard it is to get out from under that. So speaking out about it, survivors of gender-based violence, makes a big difference to the society. We have ample legislation. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to point out, just by looking at how crowded this slide is, how many pieces of legislation we have for addressing violence against women, gender-based violence, and violence against men and children, and the LGBT plus community. We have lots of legislation. We're signatories to 7 of the 9 core international agreements. And that means that our local laws have to mirror our agreements that we have signed on to. And we must enforce laws that preserve the human rights of each person in this country. And that includes the right to be free from violence. Our Ministry of Gender and Culture and our Minister, the Honorable Babsy Grange, launched a campaign, the NEFA campaign, in 2019, I believe, No Excuse for Abuse, and that still continues. And there are many, many, many outputs of this campaign. And so it has been a strong battle. And you will notice in the media that only recently, perhaps a week ago, the anti-sexual harassment law is being brought into place. And that is one of the ways in which we can stop the intimidation of women by men. So we know the statistics. Nearly 15% of all women in Jamaica say 1 in 5 women in Jamaica has been a survivor of gender-based violence, but 15% of women experience some kind of physical or sexual violence from a male partner. And this is not from a stranger. This is from their own partner in the last year. These are the statistics that we're seeing. And we know that we have in Jamaica a 10-year national strategic action plan to eliminate gender-based violence by 2030. And as I said, it was launched in 2018. I had said 2019. The Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport. So that is one of the things that we've committed to, is that from 2017 to 2027, an active, robust campaign against gender-based violence, and certainly to eliminate gender-based violence by 2030. Again, we have statistics that show the opposite as well, which is violence not just against women, but violence against men, by women and by men, and also some of the core elements that we're seeing come out when men and women get into violent acts. Dr. Herbert Gale, who has done some of the work in this area, has found that in a number of the domestic violence acts that take place in the home, the gender-based violence, it is starting off as a quarrel or a fight and then ends up being something much worse. He says that the perception of the men is that the woman has started the fight, but because of the man's physical size, he ends up winning that fight through physical force and violence. So in the perpetrator's mind, the fight starts with the woman not doing something. And believe me, when you're a survivor of gender-based violence, it doesn't matter what you do. You could look left and that would be an offense. There's no sense and sensibility around the things that the perpetrator chooses as a reason for losing their temper. They are prone to losing their temper. There's a special desk that has been set up again in the ministry, and they've reached over 309 men and boys, educating them about toxic masculinity. Very, very important. We have to begin to retrain our men and boys to value something other than being boorish, violent, aggressive, negative, and using force. For men, in the period 2015 to 2017, 82 men lost their lives to domestic violence in the island. And that's twice the number of women who died in similar circumstances. The reason for this is that men tend to use more lethal measures, and these acts of domestic violence were not always female to male, some were male to male, but men tend to be more lethal in the acts that they perpetrate than women. But men are also victims of domestic violence, and there are cases that are reported to the Special Services Desk for Men. Some of the gaps that the government has recognized in its response include that women who are victims, we don't have data on them by marital status or relationship status, we should say, the type of violence and where they're located in the island. So we're not collecting the data in a way that we can disaggregate, big word for saying, break it up into small parts and understand where the trends are. Cases of violence against women that are prosecuted are low compared to the number of complaints that come to the police. So the complaints come in, but the women don't press charges afterwards. Convictions are also low compared to the complaints because they may need the man as a breadwinner for the family. And some of them are in fear. They're literally in fear that the man may retaliate in some way. Every year, women are victims of femicide, and 25 each year has been the standard, but we do not have the data according to relational status and their geographic location. Again, convictions are lower than the number of cases that are recorded. Thankfully, women are speaking out more, and many men are coming to the rescue of women who are speaking out more. And we are recognizing as well that men can be victims of domestic violence. So the silent suffering that has taken place with men, and I want to point to something that relates to not men now, but boys. The ways in which we have think that we're disciplining our boys, where our boys are battered, our boys are brutally treated as a means of correction, and often at the hand of a mother. These are not helpful in stemming the tide of domestic violence and gender-based violence. Again, if you remember that egg-shaped model that I showed you, if the society condones brutality against children, then those same children who have experienced the brutality will turn around and brutalize someone else. What's the way forward? We need to provide more reporting services, and I say multimedia. So we're talking about technology here, not just technology in stemming the gender-based violence, but technology in also helping people to move from a violent state to one where they can actually talk about the problem instead of using their fists or any object near them. And I think multimedia, as we've seen in COVID, can reach into the homes and help us to provide services in a much more effective way than we've been doing by having people travel long distances or when the anger has cooled and they're no longer concerned about the violence. Shelters for women and children. We are, as far as I know, we have already opened a second shelter, and that's been a long time coming, but we need many more. And we need a shelter in every parish, at minimum, every parish. And some parishes, like Kingston and the metropolitan area, need 2 and 3 shelters in each of the KMA vicinities because of the numbers of people who live in the KMA. We need counseling and we need therapy. Counseling for victims of gender-based violence, and we need therapy and psychiatric help for perpetrators. We cannot continue to ignore the mental health disorder that is part and parcel of gender-based violence. To lie down with a woman at night and have children with her and get up in the morning and brutalize her is not sanity. We have to recognize the mental health component and treat with it from the get-go. Have a diagnostic test done from the very beginning of the reporting. Reconciliation, not our aim. We should not be looking for reconciliation. Even when partners wish to be together, we have to separate the idea of treating a couple so that they will go back together if nothing is done to treat the perpetrator's violent behavior, which is pathological. So yes to treatment, no to reconciliation. People of unequal power cannot negotiate any mediation or reconciliation because the power remains unequal. And I would say yes also to economic empowerment of our girls and women. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for just setting that framework for the discussion. This ecological framework that you described, you know, that interplay between the individual, the community, and the society. For me, it speaks to changing a culture. And at some point, as we move into the discussion, we're going to want to talk some more about, because changing a culture is such a difficult thing, isn't it, Karen?
It is a generational thing, intergenerational. We're thinking 25 years at a time. Change is slow, but we have to persist.
And we are at 2021 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which speak about gender equality. We must achieve this by 2030. We have 9 years.
Very short time.
We have a lot to do, but it is possible, and certainly science has some solutions. So we're going to get into that discussion a little bit more with you. We thank you for that introduction, that's setting the pace, defining the definition of GBV and the interplay of those factors, really very important. As we move into our next presentation. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Miss Alison Drayton, and Alison is the Caribbean Regional Director of the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. Based in Jamaica, Alison directs the priorities and mandate of the United Nations Population Fund across 22 countries in the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. Prior to joining UNFPA in 2016, Alison served at UNDP for 15 years. She has also served as a diplomat in Guyana's permanent mission to the United Nations. During that time, as the chairman of the Group of 77 and China, she led global negotiations on climate change, tourism, and other critical issues on the development agenda. She is absolutely qualified then to move us into the discussion, talking about changing attitudes toward gender-based violence using technology. Miss Alison Drayton, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, the first of the last 4 points from the previous speaker was a great setup into my remarks today. So we all know that these days we have high expectations of technology to enable us to advance on our deliverables that will make our lives more comfortable, to reach where science has not yet reached, and to allow for groundbreaking scientific discoveries that address global pandemics. Using technology to address GBV, one of the points the previous speaker made, may be one of the most difficult tasks for scientists to take on, because GBV is inherently about power imbalance and gender inequalities, and has, through that lens, not that much to do with science. However, technology has been critical, particularly in the last year, in allowing us to play an important role in preventing and responding to GBV, while changing the perspectives around it and raising awareness on the issues. This is increasingly in the Caribbean, I have to say, pandemic. I mean, the numbers are alarming and continuing to grow. Globally, actors are innovating with GBV, with technology. We strengthen programs and the systems that address GBV, and we improve reach and access to life-saving services. We educate communities, empower women and girls disproportionately affected by GBV. But GBV and women's rights activists are also using technology such as online tools and social media to campaign, to inform, and to mobilize. We do this not only to raise awareness about GBV and to promote gender equality, but to ensure that survivors worldwide know that they are not alone, and that there is no shame in reporting what has happened to them, and that there are a variety of services for them, along with a growing sea of support. I have to say, in the last, I would say, decade, I think this has been one of the seismic changes because for so long, victims of GBV were ashamed. They carried their cross in silence. Very little was said. And in that silence was I think, implicit assumption of many that somehow they deserved it, or they were just not strong enough, and it was a role to be a victim forever. I think shining a light on this has really been one of the most crucial changes of the last decade. So now more than ever, those of you who work with technology and those of you who want to contribute to ending gender-based violence, you can hold perpetuators to account. You can hold governments to account, and you can hold us, the international community, to account. You play a fundamental role in contributing to the prevention and response to gender-based violence, and giving survivors a voice that will be heard globally. New technologies and the investment in those initiatives really do have the power, as I've said, to address GBV and change attitudes, beliefs, and the behaviors around it. They have also, let's never forget this, the potential to prevent it from occurring in the first place. You know, in the years, I lived in the US for years, and one of the lessons I got from that time is the extent to which media helps to reframe and reshape behavior and change the perception of what is normal and what is not. And it was fascinating watching people actually develop TV shows that, you know, Modern Family, what was it, Queer Eye, you know, a number of those shows, and behind that, attitudes change because we realize that there is no such thing as otherness. And perhaps, you know, we need to think about doing more around this in the Caribbean, and how we use that piece of media as well to reframe the understanding of what is acceptable. And a great recent example, you know, building on this, is how social media, the Me Too movement, really accelerated conversations around gender-based violence at the center of the discourse, and how many people felt empowered to come forward and talk about their fairly dreadful experiences, and again change that common perception of what is allowable and what absolutely is not. So technology has been a great ally for us gender-based violence practitioners, also in developing digital information systems that adhere to safe and ethical ways of reporting and analyzing gender-based violence patterns. While there are a great number of examples and good practices on the use of technology to change attitudes around GBV from around the globe, I will focus on a few best practices from here in the Caribbean, initiatives which we at UNFPA have supported and for which local actors and governments have been a backbone, thanks to their commitment to ending gender-based violence. In the past year, while navigating this pandemic, UNFPA has been working with your governments and local actors in ways we would never have imagined pre the advent of COVID-19. And all of them have been made possible by the use of new technologies. So we really do thank the scientific community providing us with the tools to harness gender-based violence. So I'll speak a bit about 4 examples that occur to me on this. One deals with changing attitudes towards gender-based violence by strengthening programming, systems, and technical capacities. We have been able to guide partners to shift from in-person services to remote services for survivors. We provide concrete guidance around the use of technology, such as mobile phones, tablets and computers, and do so without compromising the safety of survivors. It is shown that even where survivors are locked in with their perpetuators, they are not alone and they can continue to get help. Another example is facilitating the provision of life-saving support for survivors of GBV. There are a variety of actors who offer life-saving services to survivors, but often survivors don't know where to access that help. And service providers are all too often not well coordinated in how to provide these services. So in the last year, UNFPA remotely mapped gender-based violence response services and developed referral systems across 13 countries in the Caribbean. Jamaica was one of them. And these systems allow actors to understand who's doing what, where, for whom, and link survivors to services such as health, psychosocial support, safety, security, justice, and legal aid. A third area is to mitigate gender-based violence in different settings, including during humanitarian emergencies. And I'm sure it will surprise none of you to hear that in a crisis, GBV also tends to escalate. And so all humanitarian and development actors are aware of this risk. And we work to prevent and mitigate them within our areas of our work, and particularly when we're in what we call the humanitarian development nexus. So for example, when COVID hit and movement was restricted, survivors, the risk for survivors of intimate partner violence increased because they're advised to remain home, they're locked in with their partner, they're unable to reach out to services, sometimes their phones are taken away, they have no privacy to speak. So we worked with partners to adapt to remote modalities for strengthening their capacity. And one of the things we did was to hold a series of webinars to raise awareness around the linkages between gender-based violence and COVID-19 and other emergency situations, and to inform partners about key guidance documents which we had developed so that they can help survivors access life-saving services and provide those using technology. We did an online GBV emergencies trainers. So we worked with 18 focal points from 8 countries across the Caribbean. 4 of them were from Jamaica, and we trained them over 2 weeks. And these people are now ready to respond in an emergency and not only mitigate the risks of GBV, but to design and implement programs to respond to incidents and support survivors. And all of this, aligned with global quality standards. Final example that I would cite is preventing GBV through education, advocacy campaigns, and empowerment initiatives. Here, we have also worked a lot in Jamaica. It's benefited from a social media campaign that we designed as COVID clamped down. And we provided key information and education and communication materials adapted to national contexts, and which we shared through Facebook, Twitter, national authorities, local partners. And this contained information dealing where persons at risk and survivors of GBV could access life-saving services remotely. The communication campaign included gender-based violence prevention and awareness-raising messages, which was aimed at changing and preventing violence behavior of perpetrators. And we also provided information about key sexual and reproductive health and rights. We also, and I think at the time in the Caribbean, this was an innovation. This campaign was designed, we did it in partnership with the Barbados Council of the Disabled, so that we can also target people living with disabilities who often at times like these are even more at risk than others, depending on the circumstances and their general isolation already. So these are just a few examples of the work we've done in the past year. And this was certainly a year in which we, as all of us were, had to adapt quickly, learn to make use of technology in ways that we would not have considered before. It has been a learning experience. It's taught us more than we could have imagined. And it has actually been great in that way, because one of the biggest challenges we have in the Caribbean is before, when we were designing a workshop, the assumption is you bring everyone to one place. It's prohibitively expensive. So I would say, one huge plus of the last year is Zoom and technology and media have really allowed us to expand our reach. So on the way forward, as I said, we draw from the experience of the last year, and we hope for a strengthened bond between those of us who work on GBV and the scientific community, which will allow us to, as I've already mentioned, have a wider impact and to change the narrative around gender-based violence. Through collaboration, we are better able to foster understanding and the empowerment for survivors, and to strengthen an environment and system where impunity for perpetrators is no longer an option. So I hope that our partnership will be deepened as we move forward together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alison. And what I hear coming out is the technology and the allyship with GBV practitioners. And sorry about that, just starting my video, right? So I think the way forward, looking to the way forward, I think we'll be able to flesh out a little bit more in the discussion some of the things that we can invest a lot more in. We talk about changing attitudes through education, and certainly in the Zoom era, there's a lot more reach and impact that we can have with leveraging software and leveraging the technology through these advocacy campaigns for empowerment. We also want, these 3 Ps, the prevention, the protection, and some people have talked about the prosecution and the role of technology in prosecution. I hear prevention, I hear protection, and maybe at some point in the discussion, we might want to speak some more about those 3 Ps, those 3 pillars for technology in GBV. But certainly the partnership with the United Nations and the scientific community in leveraging the technology is clear from your presentation. In the interest of time, I am going to move along to the next speaker. We are inviting those of you who are listening to send in your questions and call on somebody to join the discussion, to come and listen to our next speaker, who is Mr. Thomas McHale. And Thomas is the Deputy Director, Program on Sexual Violence in Conflict Zones with Physicians for Human Rights. Thomas McHale has more than a decade of experience in global health and public health responses to sexual violence and gender-based violence, having conducted qualitative research studies on intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and the impacts of child soldiering in conflict-affected areas of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, Kenya, the Republic of Georgia, and Uganda. Prior to joining Physicians for Human Rights, McHale worked at JSI Research and Training Institute, supporting public health programs focused on health systems strengthening, HIV prevention, and maternal and child health in Ethiopia, India, Liberia, Russia, and many other countries. Thomas McHale, everybody, is helping to provide strategic oversight and planning, including capacity development, research, fundraising, and program budgeting for PHR's program on sexual violence in conflict zones. He is well positioned then to speak to us about innovative apps for addressing gender-based violence, I give you Mr. Thomas McHale.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to speak with everyone today. Today I'm here to talk a little bit about innovative applications to address sexual and gender-based violence. But first, let's see where we're going with the presentation. First, I'll speak a little bit about the organization that I work at, and then I'll speak briefly about different mobile applications that are available currently or under development to address sexual and gender-based violence. But knowing that there's no better way to learn about a particular topic than through a case study, I'll present a case study of MediCap, which is an app that Physicians for Human Rights has been developing and piloting to address sexual and gender-based violence. So who are we? Physicians for Human Rights is an international human rights organization that uses science and medicine to address human rights violations. We leverage the skills of health professionals, physicians, nurses, and other scientists to use their unique skills to methodologically rigorously document forensic evidence of human rights abuses so that we can share a record that is hard to dispute of human rights abuses. We work on a number of areas, including sexual violence and conflict, understanding torture, detention, cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment, mass atrocities, persecution of healthcare workers, including in violations of medical neutrality, and helping survivors of grave human rights abuses obtain asylum. Our program on sexual violence in conflict zones is a multi-sectoral response program that helps to bring together medical, legal, law enforcement, and other allied stakeholders to support survivors on their path to care and justice in the medical legal process. We help to strengthen the quality of forensic evidence that can be used to help survivors access justice. But we'll get to more of that soon. There are many different kinds of mobile apps that can be used to help address sexual and gender-based violence. Some of these are under development or used by organizations around the world. First, there are apps to help connect survivors to resources. Some apps can be used to help survivors access medical information, access information about where to receive, say, mental health support or other key resources. There are apps that help aid survivors in safety planning. We spoke a lot about intimate partner violence and family violence. There are apps that can help survivors exit a situation and create a plan to help them get to safety. There are apps that have been developed in some jurisdictions to help a survivor report a crime that's either happened or ongoing. Some apps seek to mitigate the severity of an assault. I've heard of one app that plays a very loud noise that someone can use to startle an attacker. There are apps that are to help train professionals and the general population alike on gender, on sexual and gender-based violence, and help to get information and education to help either educate service providers or the general population. There are apps that are used to report data, data on the scale and scope of sexual and gender-based violence that can help governments or other large service providers understand the scale and scope of problems. And then there are apps to help document forensic evidence of sexual violence. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Today, I'll talk about the case study of MediCap, which is a mobile application that Physicians for Human Rights has developed in partnership with colleagues to document forensic evidence of sexual violence. But why did we develop MediCap? There is gross impunity for crimes of sexual violence around the world. Every year, thousands of women, men, girls, boys, and others experience sexual and gender-based violence in conflict situations, in their communities, in their homes. Many of those crimes go unreported, but those that do, many of those crimes fail because of lack of evidence. There is a big challenge in forensic evidence as related to sexual violence. Forensic evidence and cases fail because medical exams are rarely conducted. Cases fail because even when medical exams are conducted, medical charts fail to document those findings. Even when the findings are documented, there's a lack of clarification of roles within facilities, within sectors, where that all of the information that may be documented may not be all put in the same spot. There's an absence of a shared language among sectors. healthcare professionals use a very specific language. For example, an ecchymosis is a fancy word used by doctors to describe a bruise. If that word ecchymosis is found in evidence, a judge, a lawyer, a magistrate may not actually understand what that means and may discount it because they didn't understand the language. There's poor coordination across sectors. Different sectors have different roles to play. And when one sector doesn't play their full role, the other sector's work may not make its way through this chain. There's also difficulty transferring evidence to other sectors. And finally, there is a lot of evidence and data security risks. Forensic evidence can be destroyed by bad actors. It can be tampered with, or worse, or even in the case of natural disasters, evidence could be lost altogether. To address some of these challenges, PHR has developed MetaCap that helps to increase access to justice for survivors of sexual violence by enhancing the forensic evidence collection and transmission at the clinic as it's being collected during a patient encounter. But what is MetaCap? At its core, MetaCap combines a paper-based, standardized form documenting evidence of sexual and gender-based violence with photo capture capacity. This means that through the digitized form, we're able to systematically collect with healthcare providers forensic evidence of sexual violence in a way to make sure that we're not skipping any vital information and we're asking all the right questions so that valuable evidence is captured once and is able to be used by other stakeholders. The app also includes the ability to include pictures so that the photos are able to be used and submitted into evidence themselves of these crimes. MetaCap, as you can see in this workflow, is used by clinicians during a clinical encounter with a survivor. So a survivor presents at a health facility, and a clinician during a forensic exam or a post-rape exam is able to use MetaCap to document and input the findings of that examination. Once that is done, the information is able to be encrypted and safely stored in cloud storage for then transfer via a web-based application under development by PHR to police, lawyers, judges, and other sectors, allowing for a seamless transfer of forensic evidence and for allowing for the evidence to be safely secured. But what does MetaCap look like? MetaCap is an app, is pretty simple. The app takes a clinician through every single step. As you see, there's 26 different steps of the forensic exam, ensuring that all information is collected, but also saving the clinician time so that not everything needs to be written out, but a clinician can choose from drop-down menus for certain answers that would be yes or no. MetaCap also allows for a clinician to use a body map to help locate injuries on a body. You'll see the red dot here that allows a clinician to touch where they saw an injury. They can then enter a comment where they can describe the injury based on their clinical evaluation and then attach a forensic photo of that injury, allowing those using the evidence to locate an injury on a body, have a clinical description of it, and a photo supporting that clinical description. But how did we get there? MetaCap wasn't just created overnight, but it was actually created through a multi-step process. And to share some key lessons learned that I think could be helpful for the global community, I am gonna talk about three separate kind of key milestones. One is the collaborative or co-design process. The second is training, piloting, and launch with patients. And the third is scaling, partnerships, and evidence generation. PHR co-designed MetaCap with partners in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A co-design process is when the design for a piece of technology actually comes from the users themselves. Rather than PHR developing an app that we think responds to the needs of end users, PHR launched a co-design process where we learned the articulated needs of our partners and then developed an app for them to review based on their needs. We did multiple rounds of field testing, and in that field testing, we learned a couple key elements. One, Our partners needed to be able to use Medicapt when there were frequent periods without electricity. In many rural areas, electricity goes out and we couldn't have Medicapt only work when there was electricity. We recognize that Wi-Fi can be limited and connectivity can be difficult. So we developed Medicapt so that it would work. It would work when there was low bandwidth, so that when there was bandwidth available, the data would then be transferred, encrypted into the cloud. We also knew that many professionals that were partners in their clinics don't have access to printers or other supplies, so we would need Medicapt to work in just one environment in the app itself. We learned that Medicapt needed to be supported at the project, the clinic, the district, regional, and national levels, and not just in one of those places. We knew that we learned that Medicapt needed to be integrated into existing workflows, that users needed to be trained, that there were existing medical record systems that needed to work together. We needed to consider the tech literacy of different professionals and address the adoption of new technology. Not everyone was eager to adopt new technology and help the uptake of these skills. Through all of these learnings from our partners, we developed the versions of Medicapt that finally became ready for testing and piloting. Before we started our testing, our piloting with live patients, we started a robust training and capacity development program. We knew that no technology could be introduced without the proper training and many levels of training. So here you can see my colleague, Suzanne Kidenda from PHR's office in Nairobi, training our partners on how to use Medicapt, but not only how to use the app, but how to use the app with a live patient. The woman you see in the PHR t-shirt is a standardized patient. She's a Kenyan nursing student who actually was trained to pretend to be an act as a survivor so that clinicians can work with her to practice using the app and she could provide feedback so that the first time a survivor engages with Medicapt, they wouldn't know that they were the first because a clinician was able to kind of work out all of their practice with a standardized patient. Through that training that involved not only the clinicians, but other key stakeholders of the hospital, from hospital records teams to administrators and other allied stakeholders in the community, using that whole hospital approach, we finally were ready to pilot and launch Medicapt. Medicapt is now being piloted and has been launched at multiple facilities in Kenya and soon in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Clinicians have been using Medicapt to document forensic evidence of sexual violence and have had some great successes. One success I really like to think about is a survivor actually chose not to receive a copy of her forensic report and came back another day because she was afraid that her perpetrator and the family may see that she visited the hospital. Medicapt allowed for her information to be clearly and safely stored and for the survivor to have the choice of when to return to help push her case forward. The third kind of key area for us that's important in the development of Medicapt, we can see it working, but we also want to know it's working. And for us, that's really about evidence generation and documenting the innovation. I'll highlight maybe two ways of where we've been able to document, kind of generate evidence. The first is through participatory evaluation. You can see the cover of a report where we actually wrote it with the end users themselves. Rather than us saying what has been valuable about Medicapt and what the challenges are, we actually work with end users to actually write a report with them, to document and elevate their voices as a primary users. They've called themselves the pioneers, and we're really excited to work with them to highlight their voices and perspectives and help drive that forward as we think about scaling in other parts of the world. Currently, we're also doing an evaluation sponsored by the Sexual Violence Research Initiative and the World Bank to understand how Medicapt performs as compared to a standardized paper form. So we're doing an evaluation to understand the benefits of digitizing forensic evidence and to show, hopefully, as the evaluation is underway now, that how a digitalized form is improved over the standard paper-based way. We want to make sure that if we say that something works, that we have the evidence to back that up. And through all this, we've learned a couple key lessons that I would love for, for those who are developing and thinking about technology to address sexual and gender-based violence. The first is responsible technology takes time to develop. You can't make tech to work with survivors of sexual violence overnight. We hear from Silicon Valley that we should crash through barriers and be messy. We took the opposite approach. We took a respectful, measured, and careful approach so that whenever something was introduced for work with survivors, it was absolutely 100% ready. We recognize that an iterative, collaborative, and rights-based approach to the design and rollout of the app is absolutely critical, so that we listen to partners and we work side by side to ensure that the app really reflects the articulated needs of partners and the realities on the ground. We have to engage a whole hospital and community. We can't just work with the clinicians who are using the app, but all of those who are engaged. And finally, that training is key to implementation of any new mobile technology. Our vision in the future is to take Medicap really global and to help ensure that survivors of sexual violence around the world are able to access quality forensic evidence that's able to be shared, stored, and help them have their day of court and hopefully see more perpetrators held accountable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Now, I spoke earlier. I spoke about prevention, protection, and prosecution, and I think you have just helped me to understand how some of this science and technology can move us into that last P, that prosecution. But we are going to have to talk some more about the protection of this information. This is sensitive information, and we're going to have to talk some more, I think, in the discussion session about some of the issues surrounding the protection of this information. So thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next presenter. Please remember to keep putting your questions in the chat. The presenters are anxiously waiting to hear from you and respond to your questions and your comments as soon as our two other speakers have completed their presentations. Now, Thomas has evolved the discussion to a level which takes us to our next speaker, who will focus on gender-based violence, technology, and the law. He is Deputy Superintendent Warren Williams, everybody. He is second in command at the Communication Forensics and Cybercrime Division at the Counterterrorism and Organized Crime Investigation Branch of the Jamaica Constabulary Force. Warren Williams is a trained radio frequency propagation specialist and manager of terrorism investigations and cybersecurity. He holds various international certification in digital forensics and has over 20 years of experience in telecommunications, management, and engineering. He's classified by the Jamaican Post and Telegraph as a Class A radio engineer. Mr. Williams has attended several digital and cyber conferences and workshops and presented as trainer in the Caribbean, North, Central, and South America, and also in Europe. He's lecturing part-time on digital forensics and cybercrimes at the National Police College of Jamaica and Caribbean Maritime University. Mr. Williams has studied telecommunications engineering and management in the United States at the undergraduate level and pursued master's studies at the Mona ICT and Policy Center here at UWI. Mr. Williams is a consultant on cybersecurity and digital forensics. He's adequately positioned, ladies and gentlemen, to speak on gender-based violence, technology, and the law. Over to you, Warren.
I thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And let me say good afternoon to all the listeners and presenters. Very interesting topic. And of course, you would have introduced me. And let me just move on. So technology and the law. And of course, together we can end this sort of thing that is happening not only in Jamaica, but on a global scale. So from our perspective within the Jamaica Constabulary Force, I'm going to look at what is available to us in terms of legal tools to assist us to deal with situations like this. So we look at the Cybercrime Act of 2015. There are other tools which our first presenter would have made reference to, and give you some things that we advise the general listener to, things that they will do and not do to prevent themselves from becoming a victim of gender-based violence. So let us see how much we can understand our local legislation. So what is exactly violence? And, you know, we think about physical harm, but there are other aspects to it. And the meaning we look at is an action or words that are intended to hurt people. So we're looking at the physical harm and the psychological harm. But from where we sit and from the services we provide, we want to more focus on the psychological harm when it comes to gender-based violence. So cybercrime, typically we hear a lot about cybercrime now in this era of digital changes. And of course, how can it contribute to gender-based violence? So looking at the categories, it's categorized as a target, and of course as a tool. So the target can be a person, it can be a device, and of course the tool that is used to commit it, which of course is maybe your smart device, your computers. These are the necessary things that you use to facilitate that crime. And of course it can be incidental. So let us look at what is a computer. What we have in our hand nowadays as a smart device or tablets, you know, our desktops, and of course our laptops, computers. So based on the definition from our local Cybercrime Act of 2015, which is now in revision, it's now being revised. It describes it as anything, includes any data that's stored on all electronic device. An electronic device meaning that something that is able to execute a program based on the command that is given to it. So in a nutshell, all of the digital devices that we're using now, the smartphones, the tablets, the laptops, anything that is used to communicate electronically. So, you know, we will use our smart device to take photographs, to record voice notes, to see what is happening in Jamaica and across the globe. If there is a physical abuse, any violent abuse to anyone, we use it to record these acts. And of course, once we store them, we can send them and transmit them to other persons to share these violence. And of course, it can cause a lot of physical, psychological harm. So how do we classify these crimes? So it's classified in two broad groups. It can either be a straight cybercrime meaning that there's a network, such as the internet, and of course a device, such as a computer. Or it can be a computer-enabled crime, in the sense that you use the tool to facilitate your offense against the target. So let's say, for instance, someone goes missing, or someone becomes a victim of some, you know, crime which is not online, but of course it uses it to, let's say, make a telephone call, and of course send all kind of derogative information, all of this. So the computer is used as a tool to facilitate the offense, which can be considered psychological harm based on the gender-based violence. So looking at the different forms of cybercrime that we're seeing from our side of things, we are seeing using it as a tool and a target. We are seeing extortion, things like terrorism, activism, and of course, this is most important in terms of gender-based violence, revenge porn, because here it is that we can use our devices as a tool to record intimate activity within relationships. And we know once a relationship goes sour, persons now record their intimacy. And of course, if the relationship, something goes wrong, whether on either side, then you always find out that this sort of thing comes into the public space, and it causes a lot of psychological harm in the sense that persons can be, can find all kind of defamation of their character. We have had quite a number of situations, persons who are highly qualified, working different types of, jobs of different levels, has to migrate from Jamaica because they have been impacted based on what is presented into the digital space. We see things like bullying, espionage, defamation, and trafficking. So in terms of the violent nature of using these technologies to do it, we see these type of crimes coming by utilizing technology to facilitate that kind of violence. So crimes, all of these are computer cyber enabled crimes. All of these non-traditional crimes are the technology is used to facilitate these crimes. And of course, it's against all different types of gender, male and female. All of these crimes are facilitated by using the technology. So you use a mobile phone, whether to make a call, someone is called out from their homes, all of a sudden it can be a contract killing, or someone is called out of their home, and once they come out, someone is there to take their lives. We see a lot of missing person. I strongly believe that there is a correlation between social media as a technology and missing person. And of course, we know person become a part of some violent activity when they become missing or they're kidnapped or abducted. Of course, we believe that technology is used to facilitate those crimes. So some of the offenses, one of the main things I want to look at with respect to the Cybercrime Act of 2015, which is now being revised, is using a computer. This provision, and this is provision 9, using a computer for malicious communication. What does that mean? Anything that is threatening, anything that is obscene, and anything that is menacing. So any of the three elements, once these are present, of course, it can be considered as something that will impact a psychological harm to the person. So you can use your computer to send threatening messages to another gender. You can use it to, as we talk about, revenge porn, to publicize persons in their private parts and private sections of their body, put it into the public space. And of course, menacing mean that you continuously send messages that continue to threaten the person or things like that. So defining it a little more in terms of using it for malicious communication, a person commits an offense if the person uses a computer to send to another person any data, and the data can be a photograph, it can be a video, and we see it so often, in our Jamaican space where there are violent activities being committed against another gender, and the technology is used to record it and put it into the public space. It can either defame the person's character and of course cause all sorts of psychological harm. Anything that is used to send in a reckless manner to cause annoyance, inconvenience, distress, or anxiety to that person or any other person. Once you use the technology to do that, and it falls under provision 9, which is malicious communication. And of course, anything that is obscenity. Obscenity means nudity, anything that reveals the private and pubic areas of an individual, of course, that can cause a lot of psychological harm. So anything also that is of a sexual content or nature, of course, that also can be considered something that causes a psychological harm to the person, maybe not a physical violence, but of course, psychologically, it impacts the person, and of course, persons are deeply impacted by that. Looking at we have other legislations and laws that deals with it. Possession of child pornography is also an issue. So here it is that younger children, whatever gender they are also impacted in that. Persons get involved using technology. They get involved in human trafficking, things like that, and they record these youngsters, and of course, possess it on their digital device and distribute it throughout the public space. And of course, that is an offense which can cause some sort of harm to the person. So the available technology to the JCF, we have an app called Stay Alert, which is available to just about any person within the public domain. They can make a report if they are impacted by any sort of violence. They can use that app to make a report, and of course, it will come to the police and they should respond. We do have a crime intelligence management system. This collects information on perpetrators, offenders, repeated offenders. So if persons are involved in gender-based violence, we do keep a database to see if they are repeated offenders. And of course, the police will, have this sort of record to present it to the justice system so they can take the appropriate action and sentencing can be done. And of course, we do have our digital forensic capabilities in the sense that if technology is used to record any sort of violence, then we have the capabilities and the skill sets and a cadre of persons who can remove these digital evidence in a forensically sound manner and present it in a court of law, such that we can have the person properly, tried, and of course, if found guilty, put away by different sentences. So we are happy for the tools that is available to us in terms of from a legal perspective. We do have the Cybercrime Act, as I said, which is now being reviewed. Currently, if the offender is tried in a parish court, they can get from a minimum of 3 to 5 years in the parish court, or $3 to $5 million, or if it's in the higher court, the circuit court, from between 7 and 20 years imprisonment. So, personal, in recommending from our side of things, the more we educate, the less we will have to investigate. So we encourage the general public, citizens, to be wary and careful of how they use their digital devices, because you may be involved in some sort of relationship. Be careful of how that type of device is used to record, because it can be used in doing some sort of psychological harm to you at a later date. So you must be aware of that and responsible. The government has their responsibilities also to provide the necessary tools, regulatory framework, so that the law enforcement can act appropriately, the judiciary system, and of course, prosecutors and all of us as police have our independent responsibilities to ensure that we have a safe Jamaica. Just to encourage, there are some do's and don'ts, and to ensure that gender-based violence is minimized. We say password protect everything, in the sense that if things are recorded, digital evidence can be erased, it can be deleted, some can be recovered. It can be lost, someone can find it, they can see something that is inappropriate, and of course they can distribute it, and of course cause some sort of psychological harm to you because it was not properly protected. We ask you to ensure that your devices are clean. That's why we say that, because we want to ensure that once it is clean and in a proper forensic format, it means that it's not easily tampered with, such that if the evidence needs to be removed, it can be retrieved and of course prepared in a manner to present it to a court of law. And of course, to protect your devices appropriately, to ensure that perpetrators do not get access to your systems, because in terms of violence, if persons want to get at you and they get to your device with sensitive information, of course, they can remove it and use it negatively against you. And it's important to protect your personal and sensitive information. Bluetooth, be careful of the sites you visit, be careful of how you volunteer personal information. It can be used negatively against you. Be careful of the things you get on your devices. You can be lured into phishing and drawn into things that is negative. And be careful of social engineering, of how people talk to you. So we say use social media responsibly, because these are platforms which can display and, of course, use negatively against you. Once something is done in your private environment, or as we have seen, there are violence being committed against different genders. It's recorded, and of course, it ends up into the public space, and something that is meant to be private now ends up globally. And once it gets out there, there are challenges. So we have to be careful of the things we put in the public space also, because it can be used violently against you. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Warren. I do hear, coming out of Thomas's presentation, you know, we hear the fantastic outcomes of using information and communication technologies. And you have so very well put the other side to it, that we must talk about the negative consequences that ICT has elicited, you know, cyberbullying, perpetrators targeting victims, losses in privacy. So we need to work. We have a lot to do. There are lots of opportunities, but there are also lots of challenges. And where there are opportunities, there are challenges, science can provide those solutions. So we have a lot of work to do to protect all parties and to leverage the technology in this fight against GBV. We do have a number of questions coming in, and Warren, some of them are in fact for you. But before we get into those, I'm going to go to our next speaker. So once again, we thank you for that, that perspective and for bringing this into the mix. So ladies and gentlemen, we move to our final speaker on this afternoon's ticket, Miss Alicia Hammond, gender specialist with the World Bank Group. And Alicia is serving as lead on innovation and technology. She has worked on research and analysis across a range of gender equality issues, including human endowments, economic opportunities, and voice and agency. Alicia joined the World Bank Group from the Women and Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she managed strategic outreach initiatives and translated experimental gender equality research for non-academic audiences. She has also worked with UNICEF, the UN Foundation, and UN Women on many gender equality topics such as education, innovation, and data. You name it, she's worked on it. Prior to that, she worked on social development, gender equality, and human rights programs in her home country. Guess where? Jamaica. She holds a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a Bachelor of Arts in International Development and French from Mount Holyoke College. Alicia will give the final presentation on ethical and safety issues in using technology to address gender-based violence. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here today, and I also want to congratulate the Faculty of Science and Technology for really bringing us together to think through how we can address gender-based violence as a coalition, because we really need to tackle this issue together. So what I'll do today is talk about three main things. One is to provide a big picture overview of how technology could address gender-based violence around the world. Two, do a quick highlight of the evidence. So what do we know about the evidence? What do we know about what works? And three, provide a set of considerations around ethics and safety issues. So, first I wanted to zoom out and provide this bigger picture of what we're seeing in terms of how technology is being used. I think Thomas gave a fantastic overview in terms of the types of categories. And so what I'll do is just pick up on a few of those and provide some additional examples. So I have this categorization here, but this is by no means comprehensive. It's just meant to give a few examples that we've seen from around the world. So the first category is really around the open source mapping. So Harassment from Egypt is a really nice example of this that's well known. And so essentially what this is an open source mapping tool that helps to track sexual harassment and violence in public spaces. And so their approach allows for the reporting of incidents, but also the capturing of interventions by bystanders. And the idea is really to increase awareness and to start to change attitudes towards street harassment, and also to normalize the act of intervening. Another example that's not captured here, but is quite similar, is the Safe City app from Mumbai in India. And so it also collects and analyzes crowdsourced anonymous reporting of violent crime, tries to identify patterns, and also provide key insights. And the idea for this particular app is to find ways to increase accountability, improve policy making, and to support the government in allocating resources more effectively. So the second category I have here is around emergency apps. This example here is from Armenia. It's called SafeU. And SafeU enables users to seek help in emergency situations by sending free alert messages to a preset personal contacts using geolocation. So this could be family members, it could be health or other kinds of support services that, that the user can select themselves. The third category is around safety and risk planning. So again, Thomas mentioned this previously, but just to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the examples. So the one I have here is called My Plan. It was developed in the US, but it's being adapted for other contexts like the Kyrgyz Republic. And what My Plan does is it's really a decision aid that helps survivors of intimate partner violence to navigate a way forward. So you can enter information about your situation, and then a decision tool helps you to identify your priorities and also to understand the risks, and then to develop a plan for the way forward. Another category, let me go on here. So another category we see is access to information. So one example is the Mapa do Acolhimento from Brazil. And what this is a solidarity network that helps to link GBV survivors with pro bono lawyers as well as mental health professionals. And it also provides a map of GBV related services. The other category I have here is really about norms change through digital storytelling. And so this example is from Ethiopia using a podcast approach. And so the podcast intervention was for both male and female refugees. And what it does was provided an avenue to develop content to help shift norms around intimate partner violence. And what was particularly innovative about this is it's a low-cost intervention that can be used on an MP3 player or a portable phone. So it's not just about the apps on smartphones, for example. And of course, the case of Medicapt, which Thomas shared before, about access to justice through secure documentation and forensic photography. So next, I wanted to provide a quick overview about the evidence. So what do we know about what works? So what we see is that the evidence that we have, impact evaluations, they really tend to focus on safety planning apps. And what we see from the results is that women do feel more informed, secure, and supported about ways that they can enhance their safety. I'm really looking forward to the results from Medicapt as well, because that's going to make a really important contribution to the evidence space. And then, thirdly, I just want to share this review that was done recently of 171 apps that address gender-based violence. And so here you see a bit of a geographic spread. So primarily we see them in South Asia, as well as Europe and Central Asia. I looked for our region in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are 23, but unfortunately they're all from Latin America. So I'm hoping that we can see some, innovations in this space. And I think this is going to be a great start. And in terms of the categorizations, a large number are focused on emergency apps designed for one-off incidents. As we know, violence against women and girls in particular is a very complex and structural challenge. So the idea is really to start to shift towards norms change and prevention, and not just around emergency response. Some other considerations that were raised, although the apps can be downloaded for free, sometimes the costs of the calls are borne by the user. So this is something important to think about as well. And that we find that apps also need to be better connected or help survivors to connect to existing support ecosystems. So women's groups, health services, access to justice, etc. And so another important thing to keep in mind is although technology can be helpful, it's not a panacea for violence against women and girls. So into the ethical and safety considerations. So I have 10 kind of key questions, I would say, things to keep in mind. I should say I don't have all the answers, but I think this is a helpful start for us to think about a thoughtful way to use technology. Thoughtful way to use technology and identify when it's something that is really, really needed. So the first consideration, of course, is to center the safety and privacy of survivors. I think, of course, when we think about safety planning apps, for example, the priority should be to minimize harm. An example of this is if a partner finds out about an app that's on the phone, this could really increase danger, right? And so really thinking about how we can design tech solutions to avoid or mitigate the risks in that area. Another point is around the data. So data needs to be anonymized. This is really important to make sure no one has access to sensitive or identifiable data. And then again, when I mentioned design tweaks, thinking about how, do we need to camouflage the app? How do we think about the name of the app, for example? Can this be something that's not so identifiable as a way for survivors to seek support? I see apps that also have a quick exit button. So if someone comes into the room and you want to quickly exit the screen, they make that very easy. So I think these are things that we really need to keep in mind. My plan, which I mentioned before, does this really well. So what they do is they include a warning before you download the app. And it tells the users to be aware that if your partner monitors the device, having an app of this kind could put you at further risk. So really putting that at the forefront. And also some additional tips. So, if you're concerned about your partner discovering my plan on the device, could you use a device that your partner does not have access to? If it's around using it on a mobile device, can you try and delete the app when you're done? But also keeping in mind, it might not be possible to fully delete the app from your purchase history, especially on iPhones. If you're using a browser, thinking about using this on the privacy mode. And then they also provide several additional links to tech safety. So I think this is really a thoughtful way to do this. The second is really to provide referrals for care and support. This is critical. So any tech solution should really integrate some kind of trigger to connect survivors to trained professionals to help maximize their safety. And so at a minimum, any professional working with women in violent situations really have an ethical obligation to do so. Where it's possible, it's really good practice to develop a detailed directory of professionals that you can make referrals to, because the last thing you want to do is make this connection to services that are not well vetted or they're no longer operational, right? So this could really increase harm. So this is something that we have to think about carefully as well. The third point I wanted to highlight is using technology as a complement and not as a substitute. So, a couple of points here. One, the tech alone is not going to be enough. So related to the previous point, how can the tech approach make that link to trained professionals? And because that doesn't eliminate the need for a comprehensive system of support, but also how can the solution align with existing needs and demands, right? So making sure we're avoiding a situation where we have tech in search of a solution. So we see this in other spaces, for example, blockchain, I like to say is an example of this. So what is a specific problem that the technology can solve that doesn't yet exist or that another solution couldn't help to address? So really identifying the value added of the technology-based approach and thinking about this clearly is going to be important. Another point I want to make is really about considering the existing inequities or inequalities. So first, thinking about who has access to the technology that is needed to use these kinds of solutions. How do we think about centering the most vulnerable? And what design principles could we integrate to enhance access? So if this is about previously or considering the cost implications up front or thinking about data usage, these are some examples of that. but also using a rights-based as well as an intersectional approach. So thinking about how gender might overlap with age, economic status, disability status, class, etc., and making sure we have a really comprehensive analysis to assess the way the intervention may increase violence against women and girls, and thinking about ways to mitigate that. The fifth point I want to make is also considering potential biases. So we hear a lot about how technology reflects the biases of its creators. And I think not because we're not in Silicon Valley where we have the stereotype of the tech bro, that doesn't mean that that isn't our problem. This is something we really have to think about as well. So taking the time to reflect on the kinds of implicit biases that might be embedded in solutions, really questioning these assumptions and blind spots, and making sure you really have a diverse coalition of experts who can provide different perspectives as you think through the solution. Sixth is prioritizing data protection. And so this is, and privacy as well. And so this is linked to the first point I made around centering survivor safety and privacy, but more from a technical point of view. So how do we think about data storage? How do we think about ownership and the management of data? Who has access? Who has control? Where is it stored? How do we think about encryption where it's needed? And of course, anonymity, which I mentioned before. And on the other hand, do you really need to collect a lot of data? Really being thoughtful about which data is collected and why, and being strategic about that. And then an additional point is, if you do find that there are data being collected through an app, for instance, how is this data being used to further policy making, as well as making the case for additional investments that help to address gender-based violence? This is going to be really critical as well. The seventh point is making a plan for sustainability. Tech solutions require continuous investments, maintenance, and updating, which tends to be overlooked. And so is there financing to keep this technology updated, and who has responsibility? So kind of really starting with this idea at the forefront of as well of any solution. And something that Thomas mentioned as well, which Physicians for Human Rights does a really fantastic job of, is co-creating the solutions with end users as partners, right? So really making sure that the solution is appropriate and relevant, and we're bringing people along, and it's not just about copy pasting solutions from other places. And so even though this tends to be time consuming, it's really, really important, and it really helps to build buy-in for whatever we're doing in this space. The ninth point is about drawing on existing ethical frameworks for gender-based violence. So, a lot of the points I made before include an adaptation of that, but I think it's worth making the point explicitly. So thinking about drawing on existing resources, there's a lot of great guidance from various organizations that guide researchers and others through the process of working to address gender-based violence and having an ethical framework for that. So in addition to being familiar with the resources, if there's a team that wants to work on a GBV solution, maybe seeking out a GBV expert who could provide training in this area, or even inviting them to join the team, so that perspective is represented. And then finally, last but not least, considering the role of each stakeholder and building partnerships. So everyone has an important role to play. Everyone has their comparative advantage. So the private sector might be a more important partner in developing the actual technology. Looking at the public sector, really making the case and building support for investing in more support services. We know that there is a lot of need in this area. Working with women's groups and GBV experts who have a ton of experience in this space, and making sure their voices are centered, working with survivors themselves in the co-creation of any solution, and academia. So academia has a convening power, which is what we're doing today, but also the research capacity to do the testing of those solutions. So these are some considerations to keep in mind. I'd love to hear from other panelists as well, or participants, if there are any others that we can think of, and I'd be happy to keep developing this kind of rough framework, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alison. A lot there to think about, to talk about, the role of intersectionality, gender and class and race, and how these come together, this multidisciplinary approach that is absolutely critical in order for us to leverage the technology to serve the most vulnerable. These are some of the issues, some of the considerations that must be made that I hear coming out from your presentation. A lot there to think about and to talk about. We have exactly 15 minutes for discussion, so we are going to jump right into it. I do see some questions coming in from the chat. I see Thomas. I see here, what do you mean about difficulty in transferring evidence to other sectors? That one is for Warren. And for Thomas, we have, can apps like Medicapt be put to use in Jamaica? Thomas, would you want to comment on that first? Or maybe any of the panelists could jump in. How do we see Medicapt translating to the Jamaican landscape?
Sure, maybe I'll jump off and then I'll allow others to jump in. Yeah, Medicapt is a global solution that we are in the process of developing quite slowly. We're working in 2 facilities in Kenya right now and scaling up to a 3rd in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the coming weeks, which is very exciting. In the future, as Medicapt is built out for scale, we're really excited to scale in new places, including Jamaica.
Right. And so, Thomas, maybe a little bit more on the funding that's involved, to take an app like Medicapt to where you have it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've been fortunate enough to partner with a number of donors, such as UN Women, World Bank, et cetera, that have really helped us to pilot and through this really careful process. One thing that I said in my presentation, that is a very slow journey to develop safe tech for use with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and it's not something that should be overlooked. One thing that we've worked to do is really help to make Medicapt be as inexpensive as possible, so that it's really just an app that can be downloaded, and then there's a whole other support that could also work as well to help healthcare professionals be adequately trained to use Medicapt appropriately.
So maybe to move these forward, Medicapt, Harassmap, SafeU, MyPlan, maybe some public-private partnerships could be the model going forward, or those also would have to, be thrown into the mix. All right, so we're gonna go to Alison. Alison, I have one here for you. Does the United Nations have any programs on sensitizing youth on using social media responsibly? Do we have youth ambassadors on this?
That is actually a great question, very and points me in a direction, but no, at the moment we do not. In fact, one of the discussions that we have started, prompted by UN Women, is that across the board in the Caribbean, there's no legislation that really kind of governs this part of digital space. And as all of the governments, as a result of the pandemic, are highlighting the importance of digitalization, of expanding broadband and technology, and asking for assistance. My colleague, Tony Ann Broadbear, who's head of UN Women, has flagged that we really need to start a conversation. And we were thinking maybe starting it at the level of CARICOM Secretariat, so that you get an overarching agreement across the Caribbean on what are the elements that need to be addressed in legislation, and then move this forward at the national level. Falling out of that, then we would, of course, look at this with sensitization, etc. But it is a really great question, and I will certainly flag it back for further discussion with colleagues to see if this is something we can advance. Thank you.
Great question and suggestion, to have the youth ambassadors on this. Thank you, Alison. So Warren, we want you to come back in with this question. Can a victim access CIMS?
So CIMS is a crime intelligence management system. It's a database that is accessible and available only for the police. It's located at the National Intelligence Bureau. So this is a database that we compile for offenders. So if person commits a crime and the investigator or police officer want to verify if this person's name as an offender is in the database, then you compare the name and see what offense was this person previously charged for. So it's only for the JCF and not available to the wider public.
Okay, and Warren, could you talk to us a little bit about the ongoing training, or how we are doing with training for members of the JCF as we move into this era and into this space, and particularly on GBV and how we treat, not only how we leverage how we use the technology, but how we treat with victims and the technology.
Well, pretty much we must provide and continue to provide the service in terms of our mandate to serve, protect, and reassure the people of Jamaica. So wherever the victim comes up, then the closest police stations or police officers must facilitate and appreciate the report. So persons are trained right across the board. While they're in training, how to deal with it. We have different policies to deal with it. Say, for instance, gender-based, we have a diversity policy. We have a use of force policies. So police personnel are exposed to all these policies, and guidelines that they have to follow. More importantly, we have a community safety and security division, which focuses directly on issues like these that affect persons that are in families and communities, so they work more directly with these victims. But in terms of training, most, if not all, police personnel, that's a part of the training curriculum, which they're exposed to these policies and guidelines, which must be adhered to and followed. And of course, any deviance, there can be some sort of repercussion for that.
We actually have two more for you, Mr. Williams, before you go. How are our members of the constabulary on the use of the technology, on ICT, and what is the infrastructure like?
All right, you're saying the JCF in general, where are we with ICT?
Yes.
Yes, the JCF and you will see the commissioner showcasing where we have Jamaica I. We are part of that program. We are modernizing the JCF. We're putting in different infrastructures. We work with NWC, capitalizing on the existing fiber optics. We are now connecting. We're on a project of interconnecting all police stations, computerizing them. We're computerizing a lot of our paper-based, reports, and we're digitizing those. So it's an ongoing project. I could say we're about maybe 50% there, and of course we're getting there.
So wonderful. So we are ready, and the JCF stands as a partner ready to collaborate with scientists and all of us who are involved in bringing these solutions to our population. We have one more for you, Warren, before you go. You're a popular guy here. And this one says, how do we balance the need for addressing online GBV with freedom of expression? Often, cyber laws can get misused if they are written too broadly. So the key is balance.
How do we deal with it in terms of online?
How do we balance that need for addressing online gender-based violence, addressing these things online with freedom of expression?
Okay, so we do have a cybercrimes division, and as the name connotes, where our focus is on online crimes. I did define the difference between a straight cyber crime and a cyber-enabled crime. So we capture those that are not online, and of course the things that are facilitated by technology to commit a crime. So indeed, it doesn't matter whether it's in space, using the digital platform or not. But once it's online, the cyber crimes unit is here. We do have persons with training and skill set that have the capabilities to investigate these crimes. So if the offenders, utilize that sort of medium to facilitate their violent activity, we have a digital lab, we have a communication forensic lab, we are partners, we are part of a wider network, a global network, which is a 24/7 network of 86 other countries. So we have access to other, cohorts of persons who are involved in similar investigation and monitoring. So let's say an offender originates outside of Jamaica, we get the support from our partners, in other jurisdictions.
Okay, and that question was actually from Alicia. And Alicia, I want you to come in here I'm just going to open up a little bit of a discourse between you and Warren. I want you to come in here on that and comment on his response.
Thank you so much, Warren. So yeah, that question is from me because this is something we've been thinking about for many years now. So, we see that a lot of countries, a lot of governments are starting to enact cybercrime laws. And on one hand, I think from women's rights groups, we want to have a tool with which we can address this issue. The challenge that I've seen in a lot of different spaces is these laws get written very broadly. And so, when you have a very broad written law, I think you had mentioned threatening, obscene, and menacing behavior, which is still quite broad, right? Then there's a risk that this law can get misused against human rights activists, people who are speaking out against issues. And so in the end, if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And so the issue around the legal dimension is it's one tool, but we need it to be nuanced and really specific and in complement with a lot of other approaches. So I just wanted to kind of, have a dialogue about that, because I think it's going to be really important to frame these laws in a way that does not compromise human rights and freedom of expression.
I really like your observation, Alicia, and maybe we need to get you to be a part of the Joint Select Committee. So, because as it is now, we are making submission from the Ministry of National Security. Just about a week ago, we made a submission to the Joint Select Committee, who's now looking and revising the existing law. And you're correct, things like threatening, obscene and menacing, we think it was too broad. Even things like sending, what does sending mean? So we're trying to tighten the legislation, and you're correct. We find out that a lot of them are a little bit too broad and need to be, definitive, such that, we can actually capture these offenses in a more holistic way and ensure that we do not abuse human rights. And you're perfectly correct.
I appreciate that, Warren. And just to add one quick point, I think obviously an example from New Zealand is not necessarily applicable for us, but what we see there is they have an office that also engages in education at the school level, engaging with community-based organizations in this area. And so to the extent to which, if you're revising this now, you can really pull others in, particularly GBV experts who can give that advice, and human rights experts who might be able to help narrow the scope a bit, so it can be an effective approach versus something that might create harm.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is that the submission comes from many different sectors, and of course, it's inclusive of public and private entities. so we can get a broader perspective or a holistic perspective that it's not just a government thing, but it involves other private entity from citizens, within the country. They can make their contribution, and the Joint Select Committee take it into consideration.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to put the final question to Thomas. I think, Thomas, you could take this one. What ecosystem would be required to adopt Medicapt?
It's such a wonderful question, and I think the ecosystem that really for adoption of Medicapt is willing stakeholders. Are there government or other institutional bodies who are willing to take on Medicapt and to integrate into existing workflows, ministries, hospitals, et cetera, to really to support that. I think the other key consideration is, what funding is available, within the health system. Is there room to increase support for services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, which is traditionally around the world has been underfunded. And I think finally, a willingness to really change standard operating procedures of how survivors receive care and the quality of care, because Medicapt is an app that really helps to document, but it also helps to train healthcare professionals to enhance the quality of a survivor-centered clinical interaction. So I think that those would be some of the key preconditions.
Okay, wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end. In fact, time has run out on us. We have a lot more things to talk about here, and maybe we will have to do a part 2. But what is left for me to do now is to thank everyone who was involved in putting this forum and making this forum a success. It is really something, and I saw some comments I see from Leith Dunn congratulating the FST for hosting a forum like this one. It is a very important discussion. It has revealed to us, you will agree, a number of opportunities for ICT, for technology, for science. But we have also seen the challenges, and we know science has the solutions. We want to thank all our speakers. We had Karen Carpenter, who defined GBV and established the Jamaican landscape, setting the ecological framework for the discussion. Alison, who showed the allyship between GBV practitioners in changing attitudes, providing support for survivors and helping to mitigate during emergencies. And then Thomas came in with the specific examples now, beginning with Medicapt. And Alicia also expanded in her presentation, talking about other apps, HarassMap, SafeU, MyPlan, 171 apps and more needed. Warren reminded us that the technology had fantastic outcomes, but has been used to elicit negative consequences like cyberbullying, and the discussion about losses in privacy, which Alicia also expanded on, reminding us of the ethical considerations that must be made and must be addressed before these interventions and the technology can actually begin to make people's lives better and cause more good than bad. So everyone is reminding us that data protection is key. In the end, all speakers agree that technology has been a part of the solution to GBV and must be leveraged further in the fight against GBV in Jamaica. The mission of science, ladies and gentlemen, to make people's lives better, and the opportunities that are out there are tremendous. So from here at the FST, we are thanking all the speakers. We're thanking the audience for a robust discussion. We are thanking also colleagues and support staff at the FST, all the external engagement committee led by Dr. Andre Coy, we have Dr. Gunjan Mansingh, we have Ms. Terry Ann Collins-Frey, who has been providing us with tremendous support. We want to thank the team from MITS, and we want to say to all of you, remember, the FST is your go-to place for science, for knowledge, for research and solutions. Have a good evening, everybody, and please keep safe.